Welcome back to the deep dive. We are looking at a stack of sources today that tells a story everyone thinks they know. But the timeline you've pulled together here suggests we usually get the psychology of it completely wrong.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. We're looking at the American Revolution, but not the actual war. We're looking at the prelude.
The road to revolution, as it's often called.
It is, but I prefer to think of it as a breakdown. A systemic failure of a relationship that had been working, more or less, for 150 years.
And it is a fast breakdown. I was looking at the dates on these documents, and the contrast is actually jarring. We're starting our deep dive in 1763.
Right, the end of the 7 Years' War.
And at that moment, based on the letters and the editorials in this pile, the American colonists were arguably the most patriotic British subjects on the face of the earth. They were drinking toasts to King George III. They were buying British fashions. They were proud of the Union Jack.
Absolutely, 100%. They had just spent 7 years fighting and bleeding alongside the British Army to defeat France. They felt like they were the tip of the spear of the British Empire.
Yeah.
They weren't looking for an exit. They were looking for a hug.
And yet, fast forward just 11 years to 1774, and the tone in these sources shifts violently. It's night and day.
Oh, it's a different planet.
You go from God Save the King to stockpiling gunpowder, tarring and feathering customs officials, and organizing a continental resistance. 11 years, that's nothing in historical time.
It's a blink of an eye. If you think about it, 11 years ago from today, we were in a completely different political era, but the fundamental structure of the country hadn't changed. In this period, the entire concept of who they were changed.
So that is the mission for this deep dive. We aren't just reciting dates and acts. We need to figure out how things fell apart so quickly. We're tracing this psychological and political unraveling to understand how you turn a loyal subject into a rebel in just over a decade.
And we're going to do that by looking at the specific mechanisms, the laws, the debts, and, frankly, the misunderstandings that drove the wedge in. It's a story of miscalculation on both sides, but especially from London.
Okay, so we have a lot to get through. Let's start with the context before the meltdown, the honeymoon phase, if you will. The sources refer to a policy called salutary neglect. I'm looking at this description, and it essentially sounds like absentee parenting.
That's a fantastic characterization. That's exactly what it was. For nearly the entire first half of the 18th century, Britain was busy. They were fighting these huge dynastic wars in Europe, the War of the Spanish Succession, the War of the Austrian Succession.
Right, they had bigger fish to fry.
Bigger fish to fry, exactly. They simply didn't have the bandwidth or, frankly, the interest to micromanage the colonies in North America. The model was basically don't cause trouble and make sure the raw materials keep flowing.
So as long as the timber, the tobacco, the indigo, as long as that stuff kept showing up on the docks in London and Bristol, the Crown didn't look too closely at how the colonies were running their internal affairs.
Largely, yes. I mean, there were navigation acts on the books, theoretically regulating trade.
Yeah.
But enforcement was incredibly lax. It was a known secret.
And the result, looking at these colonial charters, was that they built their own little semi-autonomous states. I see the Massachusetts charter mentioned here. They had their own assembly, their own lower house.
The House of Representatives in Massachusetts, the House of Burgesses in Virginia.
They levied their own local taxes to pay for roads and schools. They paid their own governors. They were, for all intents and purposes, self-governing.
Precisely. They developed a muscle memory for self-governance. You have to understand, by 1763, you had fourth or fifth generation Americans. Their great-great-grandparents might have come from England, but they'd never been there. They'd never known anything but local rule.
So they saw their assemblies, their local governments, as sort of miniature parliaments.
They saw them as equal to the House of Commons in London, just operating in a different sphere. Parliament could regulate the empire's trade, fine. But when it came to their own internal affairs, their own property, that was the job of their own elected representatives.
There's a fantastic quote in the research packet from a Captain Levi Preston of Danvers, Massachusetts. He was a veteran of the Revolution, interviewed decades later when he was an old man.
Oh, this is a great one.
Yeah, the interviewer asked him why he fought, was it the Stamp Act, the tea tax, all the philosophical arguments from Locke and so on. And reading the transcript here, Preston just waves all that away.
He finds it almost amusing, right? The academic trying to pin him down.
Exactly. He says, I never drank much tea. I never saw one of those stamps. He says the big arguments never felt. When the interviewer presses him on why he went out to kill British soldiers, he said, we always had governed ourselves and we always meant to. They didn't mean we should.
That is the core of the conflict right there. It's so simple and so profound. It wasn't about a radical new idea of liberty. It was a deeply conservative impulse to protect the status quo they had enjoyed for a century.
They like things the way they were.
They loved things the way they were. But in 1763, the British government decided the way things were was over. The era of salutary neglect came to a screeching halt.
And this brings us to that turning point. The end of the 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War. On paper, this is a massive, world-altering victory for Britain.
It's the peak of the First British Empire. They kick France completely out of North America. They take Canada. They take all the land east of the Mississippi River. They control India. They are the undisputed global superpower.
It should have been a moment of imperial triumph and unity.
It should have been. But, as any economist will tell you, winning a war is often more expensive than losing one. And this war was astronomically expensive.
I'm looking at the financial breakdown here, and the numbers are catastrophic. The British national debt doubled during the war. It hit £133 million in 1763.
133 million pounds. It's hard to even contextualize that number. The source notes that the average British yearly income for a laborer was maybe 40 pounds. This is a debt that the entire nation feels.
And the interest payments alone, just the service on the debt, were £5 million a year.
Right, and get this. The entire annual budget of the British government at the time was only about £8 million.
Wait, really? So they're spending more than 60% of their entire national income just to pay the credit card bill on the war?
Exactly. The empire was technically insolvent. Landowners in England were already paying a tax rate of about 20%, and they were screaming that they couldn't pay another shilling.
So the politicians in London, specifically the new Prime Minister, George Grenville, are in a panic. They have to find new revenue, and fast.
And they look at the map. They look across the Atlantic and they say, wait a minute. We spent a fortune defending the American colonies from the French and their native allies. The Americans are the primary beneficiaries of this peace. Why aren't they paying for it?
Which, from a sheer accounting perspective, sitting in an office in Whitehall seems like a perfectly reasonable question.
It does. It seems logical. The problem is, the colonists didn't see it that way at all.
How did they see it?
The colonists argued that they had paid for it. They provided something like 25,000 soldiers to the war effort, which is an enormous number for their population. They spent their own blood and treasure. Massachusetts alone was nearly bankrupt from its own war debts.
So when London said, time to pay up, the Americans said, we already gave at the office.
We already paid in lives and in money. This was an imperial war. We fought our part, and now you want to send us the bill for the whole thing. No thanks. It was a fundamental disagreement about who the war was for.
And there's another factor here in 1763 that seems to have spooked the colonists even more than the debt. The decision to keep a standing army of 10,000 British regulars in North America.
This was a huge red flag. It was unprecedented. In British political culture, going all the way back to their own Civil War, a standing army in peacetime was synonymous with tyranny. It's what kings used to oppress the people.
Why do you need 10,000 soldiers when the French are gone? Who are they there to fight?
Well, the official reason given was defense. First, to protect the new frontiers from Native American uprisings. And there's a real basis for this. Pontiac's War broke out right at this time, a massive coordinated attack by various tribes against British forts in the Great Lakes region.
Okay, so that's a plausible reason.
Plausible, yes. The second reason was to guard against any attempt by France or Spain to retake their lost territory. But if you look at the private correspondence of British officials, there was a more cynical motive.
Patronage.
Jobs for the boys. It was absolutely jobs for the boys. The British Army Officer Corps was staffed by the sons of the aristocracy. It was how you provided a career for the second and third sons of lords who wouldn't inherit the family estate.
So if you disband the army after the war, all those well-connected young men lose their commissions and their paychecks, and they come home to London and become a political problem.
Exactly. Keeping the army in America was a convenient way to employ the elite on the public dime, and the colonists knew this. They saw it for what it was.
So the colonists are looking at these soldiers who are often quartered in their cities, taking up jobs, causing fights, and thinking, we're paying taxes to support an army we don't need, commanded by guys who just want a paycheck, and they are watching us.
That was the creeping fear, that the army wasn't there to protect them from the Indians, but to enforce these new taxes that London was planning.
And then, to add insult to injury, you get the Proclamation of 1763.
Right. In the middle of all this, Britain draws a line down the spine of the Appalachian Mountains and says, no settlement west of this line. Everything west is an Indian reserve.
This must have been infuriating. I see land speculators like George Washington were furious. They had literally just fought a war specifically to open up that land in the Ohio Valley.
They felt like the prize they had just won was being snatched away.
Yeah.
Britain's motive was, again, financial. They wanted to avoid expensive, drawn-out Indian wars that they couldn't afford. It was a budget decision.
But to the Americans, it felt like they were being penned in. They were being treated like children who couldn't be trusted to leave the yard.
You've got it. So the
Yeah.
vibe in 1763 is shifting dramatically. The war's over. They should be celebrating. But instead, there's this growing sense of anxiety and resentment. The parent has come home from the long business trip, and they are cracking down.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly. Let's move to Section 2. The constitutional crisis begins. 1764, the Sugar Act.
This is Grenville's first attempt to extract that revenue. Now, the Sugar Act is fascinating because technically it cut the tax on molasses in half.
I was reading that the old Molasses Act of 1733 was 6 pence per gallon. The Sugar Act of 1764 dropped it to 3 pence. So why were the merchants in Boston screaming about tyranny over a tax cut? That doesn't make any sense.
It makes perfect sense when you understand that nobody paid the old tax.
Uh-huh.
The 6 pence tax was so high that it would have put the New England rum distillers out of business. So for 30 years, they just smuggled French molasses. It was an open secret.
And the customs agents just looked the other way.
They were famously corrupt. You'd slip them a bribe, about 1.50 per gallon, and they'd stamp your papers and look the other way while you unloaded your French molasses. It was institutionalized smuggling, and the whole New England economy was built on it.
So the Sugar Act lowered the rate to 3 pence, but it actually created a mechanism to enforce it.
Exactly. The point of the new act wasn't just the tax, it was the crackdown. It added new, complicated paperwork, bond requirements, and crucially, it moved smuggling trials to vice admiralty courts in Halifax, Nova Scotia.
And these are the courts without juries, right?
Correct. This is a huge deal. If you were a Boston merchant accused of smuggling, you weren't judged by a jury of your neighbors who were probably smugglers themselves.
Right, who would be very sympathetic.
Very sympathetic. Instead, you were hauled hundreds of miles away to be judged by a single royal judge. And here's the kicker. That judge was entitled to 5% of the value of any confiscated cargo as part of his fee.
Wow. So the judge has a direct financial incentive to find you guilty.
The deck was stacked against you. For colonists who revered the English tradition of trial by jury, this was an abomination.
But the Sugar Act was still mostly a merchant issue, right? It hit the coastal cities, but if you were a farmer in the interior, you didn't really care about the price of molasses.
That's true. It created a lot of noise in Boston and Newport, but it didn't unify the colonies. That was the job of the Stamp Act in 1765. This gets branded as the big blunder.
And it really was, wasn't it?
It was a blunder of epic proportions. Grenville still needed money, and he decided to go for a direct tax. Not a trade duty, an external tax, but a tax on the internal transactions of the colonies.
I'm looking at the text of the act here, and it is obsessive. It's not just legal documents like wills and deeds. It lists newspapers, pamphlets, almanacs, even playing cards.
And dice. It specified that every single die in a pair had to be individually stamped to prove the tax was paid.
It even lists academic degrees. If you graduated from Harvard or Yale, you had to pay a tax on your diploma. It feels like they went out of their way to annoy the most articulate and argumentative people in the colonies. The lawyers, the journalists, the tavern goers, and the students.
That's exactly what they did. Unintentionally, they targeted the opinion makers, the very people who could and would write pamphlets and give speeches against it. But here is the aha moment that often gets missed in the textbook version of the story.
What's that?
The tax itself wasn't that expensive. The actual monetary cost was quite low.
The data implies the average American tax burden was laughable compared to what people in Britain were paying. The source says a Briton paid about 26 shillings a year in various taxes. The Stamp Act was estimated to cost the average American about 1 shilling per year.
It was a pittance. So this was never about the money. It was about the precedent. It was about the principle of the thing. This is where no taxation without representation stops being a slogan and starts being a core constitutional argument.
Explain that distinction. What was their argument?
The colonists, drawing on a century of English political thought, believed that their property could not be taken from them in the form of taxes without their consent, and consent could only be given by representatives they had actually elected.
And since they didn't elect anyone to the Parliament in London,
Parliament had no right to tax them directly, period. It was unconstitutional. It violated their fundamental rights as Englishmen.
But didn't the British have a counter-argument? I see the term virtual representation here.
He did, and it's a very clever argument in its own way. The defenders of the Stamp Act in Parliament said, look, there are massive, growing industrial cities in England, like Manchester and Birmingham, that don't have a single representative in Parliament because of how our ancient districts are drawn.
Right, the rotten boroughs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They said, but are the people of Manchester unrepresented? No, they are virtually represented because every member of Parliament doesn't just represent his little district. He represents the interests of the entire British Empire.
So by that logic, Parliament represents the people of Boston just as much as it represents the people of Birmingham.
That was the theory. And the Americans, led by thinkers like James Otis in Massachusetts, called foul. They said, that might work for Manchester, because at least the members of Parliament share the same land, the same economy, and the same burdens. If they cast a high tax on Manchester, they're indirectly taxing their own constituents and themselves.
There's a check on their power.
Right. There's a natural limit.
Yeah.
But Otis argued, you guys are 3,000 miles away. If you tax us, you save yourselves money. Our burden is your benefit. There is no check on your power. You could tax us into oblivion.
And this is where the resistance turns from angry letters to something much more physical. The Sons of Liberty form. And the violence described here is visceral. It's not just holding signs and chanting.
No, it's what some in London would have called domestic terrorism. Look at what happened to Andrew Oliver, the man appointed to be the stamp distributor in Boston.
They hung an effigy of him from a tree, the Liberty Tree, and then they paraded it through the streets, and then they burned it on a bonfire in front of his house.
And that was just the Wartup Act. Look at what happened to Thomas Hutchinson, the lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. He was a wealthy, native-born Bostonian from a long-established family. But he was seen as a defender of royal policy.
The description of the riot on August 26, 1765 is wild. A mob descended on his mansion. They didn't just break his windows. They broke down the doors with axes. They looted the place. They drank his entire wine cellar dry.
They stole the furniture, the silver, even his collection of historical manuscripts, which was an irreplaceable loss. And then, this detail is just crazy. They got up on the roof and started tearing it off the house, shingle by shingle.
They worked through the night to literally dismantle his home brick by brick. Hutchinson and his family barely escaped with their lives out the back door. This sent a chill down the spine of every royal official in America.
You better believe it. The stamp distributors in every colony were so terrified that they all resigned before the act even went into effect on November 1st.
So the law was effectively nullified by the mob. You literally could not buy a stamp because there was nobody brave enough to sell you one.
Exactly. Mob action worked. Right. And at the same time, you had a more respectable form of resistance. The Stamp Act Congress met in New York City with delegates from 9 colonies.
The first time we see this kind of intercolonial cooperation.
It was a huge step. They wrote a series of resolutions, very respectful in tone, but firm, laying out their constitutional rights as Englishmen. And crucially, merchants in the major ports organized a boycott of British goods.
And that hit London where it hurt the wallet.
Yes. British merchants and manufacturers started screaming at their MPs to repeal the act because their American orders had dried up. The combination of mob violence, political protests, and economic pressure was overwhelming.
Parliament caved. They repealed the Stamp Act in March 1766.
They did, and there were massive celebrations in the colonies. They built statues of King George III. They thought, okay, the system worked. We complained. They listened. The relationship is saved.
But they missed the fine print.
They totally missed the fine print.
Yeah.
On the very same day that Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, they passed another, much shorter law, the Declaratory Act.
It sounds like a boring procedural motion, but the language is incredibly aggressive. I'm reading it here. Parliament has, and of right ought to have, full power and authority to make laws to bind the colonies and people of America, in all cases whatsoever.
In all cases whatsoever. It was a face-saving measure for Parliament, but it was also a direct rebuttal to the colonists' entire argument. It was Parliament saying, we are letting you off the hook on this specific tax for practical reasons, but don't you think for a second that we agree with you. We believe we own you, and we reserve the right to prove it whenever we want.
So it was a repeal of the tax, but a doubling down on the power.
Precisely. It basically guaranteed that this fight wasn't over. It had just entered a temporary truce.
Which brings us to Section 3. Escalation and bloodshed, 1767 to 1772. The British government still needs money. The debt hasn't gone away. So a new guy, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, thinks he has a workaround.
Townshend was, by all accounts, brilliant and arrogant. He thought the colonists were unsophisticated. He thought he could outsmart them.
And his big idea was to make a distinction between internal and external taxes.
Right. He read some of the colonial arguments, including some things Benjamin Franklin had said to Parliament, and he got this idea that Americans only hated internal taxes like the Stamp Act, taxes on things happening inside the colonies. So he said, fine, I'll give them external taxes duties on goods imported into the colonies.
This is the Townshend Acts. Taxes on a list of specific goods: glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea.
He thought the Americans would accept this because, historically, Parliament had always regulated imperial trade. He thought he'd found a loophole in their own logic.
But reading the response from John Dickinson, the famous Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, it's clear the colonists weren't buying the distinction anymore.
Not for a second. Dickinson's letters were serialized in newspapers across the colonies, and they were hugely influential. He basically argued that intent matters. It's not about where the tax is collected. It's about the purpose of the tax.
So, if Parliament lays a duty to regulate trade like putting a high tariff on French molasses to encourage people to buy British molasses, that might be legitimate.
Right, that's regulating trade. But Dickinson argued that the Townshend duties were different. The law itself stated that the money raised would be used to pay the salaries of royal governors and judges in the colonies.
And that's a big deal because up until then, the colonial assemblies paid the governor's salary.
Yes, it was their main source of leverage. It was called the power of the purse. If a governor started acting like a tyrant, the assembly could threaten to withhold his paycheck. It kept him honest.
So by having London pay his salary, the governor is no longer accountable to the people he governs. He's only accountable to the king.
Exactly. Dickinson said this proves that Townshend duties are not for regulating trade. They are for raising revenue to strip us of our power. Therefore, it is a tax. And if it's a tax, it requires our consent. He famously wrote, "We are taxed without our own consent, expressed by ourselves or our representatives. We are therefore slaves."
He used the S word.
He did. And that rhetoric, comparing their situation to slavery, really resonated. The boycott of British goods started up again. And in Boston, the customs commissioners were so harassed and threatened that they fled to an island in the harbor.
The situation was spiraling out of control.
It was. The breaking point was the seizure of John Hancock's sloop, the Liberty, on suspicion of smuggling. That led to a massive riot. So London decided to send in the troops again. But this time, not to the frontier. They sent them into the city of Boston.
The occupation of Boston, October 1768. The sources say 4 regiments of British regulars, that's about 4,000 troops, in a town of only 16,000 people.
Do the math. That is 1 soldier for every 4 civilians, 1 for every man, woman, and child.
I can't even imagine that in my own neighborhood. Red-coated soldiers patrolling the streets, challenging you at checkpoints, their tents pitched on the Boston Common.
And these soldiers were poorly paid. So to supplement their income, they took part-time jobs at the rope walks, the shipyards, and the docks. And they would work for less than the locals.
So they're not just an occupying army, they're economic competition.
They are taking jobs away from the very people who already hate them. It was a powder keg. And for 18 months, the tension just built and built. Street brawls, arguments, simmering resentment.
And the fuse was finally lit on the cold, snowy night of March 5, 1770, the Boston Massacre.
It started, as these things often do, with something small. A lone British sentry standing guard outside the customs house. A few local apprentices started taunting him, calling him a lobsterback.
The taunts turned snowballs.
The snowballs turned into chunks of ice, then rocks, then oyster shells from the street. The sentry called for backup. Captain Thomas Preston arrived with a small squad of soldiers.
And the crowd grew. The church bells started ringing, which was the signal for a fire, so people poured out of the taverns and homes into the streets.
The soldiers were cornered. They were being pressed by this angry, yelling crowd who were daring them to shoot. Someone yelled, "Fire!" To this day, we still don't know for sure if it was Captain Preston giving an order or a shout from the crowd, and the soldiers panicked. A volley of shots rang out.
11 men were hit. 5 of them died.
Including Crispus Attucks, a sailor of mixed African and Native American descent. He was right at the front of the crowd. He's often considered the first casualty of the American Revolution.
Paul Revere's famous engraving of the event made it look like an organized execution of innocent citizens. It was a masterpiece of propaganda.
It was. It was printed and distributed all over the colonies. It fixed the image of British tyranny in the American mind.
Now, here is the contradiction in the timeline I can't quite reconcile. You have 5 colonists dead in the snow. The city is on the verge of open war. And yet, who steps up to defend the British soldiers in court? John Adams, the biggest patriot in town.
It does seem counterintuitive, doesn't it? He took huge risk. His friends and allies were furious with him. But if you look at Adams' diary entries from that week, he was thinking long term.
He wasn't doing it to help the British?
No. He was doing it to save the soul of the resistance. He believed passionately in the rule of law. He knew that if the soldiers were lynched or given a sham trial by a vengeful Boston jury, the patriot cause would lose the moral high ground.
He wanted to prove to the world that Massachusetts was governed by law, not by the mob.
Exactly. And he gave a brilliant defense. He argued that the soldiers were acting in self-defense, provoked by a motley rabble. And he won. He got Captain Preston acquitted, and most of the other soldiers were convicted only of manslaughter, which meant they were branded on the thumb and sent home. It was a masterpiece of legal defense.
And ironically, in a bit of historical coincidence, on the very same day as the massacre, March 5, 1770, Parliament back in London repealed most of the Townshend duties.
They did. The boycotts had worked again. The taxes were costing more to collect than they were bringing in, but they left one.
They kept the tax on tea.
Just the one. Lord North, the new prime minister, and King George III specifically said there must always be one tax to keep up the right of taxation. It was a symbol, a reminder of who was in charge.
So after the trial, things seem to enter a quiet period. The troops are pulled out of Boston proper, the boycotts end, things calm down for a couple of years.
On the surface, yes. But under the surface, the machinery of the revolution is being built. And this is where Samuel Adams, John's more radical cousin, really shines. He creates the Committees of Correspondence.
What were these exactly?
This was Sam Adams's brainchild. He realized that the British strategy was always to isolate the colonies, especially Massachusetts. If Virginia doesn't know what's happening in Boston, they can't get angry about it and they can't help.
So he created a standing committee in Boston to write letters.
To write letters, share intelligence, and coordinate responses with other towns in Massachusetts, and then eventually with other colonies.
You compared this to a pre-digital internet in our prep call.
It functioned exactly like that. Right. It was a distributed network for sharing information about British abuses. It meant that when the British did something in Rhode Island, people in South Carolina heard about it within a matter of weeks. It created a shared reality, a collective consciousness for the Americans. It helped them stop thinking of themselves as Virginians or New Yorkers and start thinking of themselves as Americans.
And they needed that network because in 1772, we have the Gaspee Affair. This feels like an action movie script.
It does. The HMS Gaspee was a British customs schooner that was notorious for harassing smugglers in Rhode Island's Narragansett Bay. Its captain was particularly hated.
One day in June, it ran aground while chasing a smuggler.
It got stuck. Yeah. And that night, a group of prominent Rhode Islanders, led by a merchant named John Brown, rowed out to the ship. They boarded it, they overwhelmed the crew, they shot the captain in the groin, the sources say, and then they set the ship on fire and burned it to the waterline.
That is a flagrant act of war, burning a Royal Navy ship.
It was treason, and Britain responded furiously. They sent a Royal Commission of Inquiry to investigate and threatened to drag any suspects to London for trial.
And that threat terrified the colonists more than anything. The idea that you could be snatched from your home and tried 3,000 miles away by a hostile court, it confirmed their worst fears about tyranny.
The Committees of Correspondence went into overdrive, spreading the news. The stage was set for the final act.
Which brings us to the final spiral, Section 4, the party and the punishment. 1773, the Tea Act.
Okay, we need to bust a major myth here. We all learned in school that the Tea Act raised the price of tea, and that's why the colonists were angry. But looking at the numbers, it actually lowered the price of tea.
Significantly lowered it. So why were they mad? I mean, if I can get my Earl Grey cheaper, why am I dressing up like a Native American and throwing it in the harbor?
Because of who was selling it and why. The Tea Act was not really about the colonies. It was essentially a corporate bailout for the British East India Company.
EIC, the giant multinational corporation of its day.
The engine of the British economy in India. But by the 1770s, it was rotting from corruption and mismanagement. The sources highlight that the EIC had a surplus of 17 million pounds of unsold tea sitting in its London warehouses. They were on the verge of bankruptcy.
And if the EIC collapsed?
The entire London financial market would likely collapse with it. It would be a catastrophe for the British economy.
So this was too big to fail, 18th century style.
Precisely. So Parliament, where many MPs were EIC stockholders, passed the Tea Act. It allowed the company to ship that surplus tea directly to the American colonies and sell it through its own chosen agents.
Bypassing the colonial merchants who usually acted as middlemen.
Right. And it also meant that even with the small Townshend duty on tea still in place, the company's tea was now cheaper than the smuggled Dutch tea that most colonists drank.
But the colonists saw it as a trap.
A Trojan horse. The radicals, like Sam Adams, argued that this was a clever trick. They believed that if they bought the cheap tea, they would be implicitly accepting the tax. They would be swallowing the poison pill of Parliament's right to tax them just because it was coated in cheap sugar.
It was a test of principle over pocketbook.
And principle one, in ports like Philadelphia and New York, they simply refused to let the tea ships unload. But in Boston, the royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson,
The same guy whose house was destroyed.
the very same. He was determined to enforce the law. He refused to let the ships leave the harbor until the tea was unloaded and the tax was paid. It created a standoff.
So on the night of December 16, 1773, we get the Boston Tea Party. And the scale of this event is what struck me in the notes. This wasn't a few guys jumping a couple of crates.
No, this is a highly organized political action. Several thousand people watched from the wharf as the Sons of Liberty, some disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded the three ships. It took them 3 hours.
And they dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. That is 90,000 pounds of loose leaf tea. The value was roughly 10,000 pounds sterling.
In today's money, depending on how you calculate it, that's somewhere between $1 and $2 million of corporate property destroyed in 3 hours. This is not a minor protest.
And yet it was remarkably disciplined. The sources mention they accidentally broke a padlock to get into the hold of one of the ships. The next day, the Patriots went back and replaced the padlock.
They wanted to send a very clear message. We are not common criminals or rioters. We are political protesters. We destroyed the tea, the object of the tax, but we didn't steal a single ounce for ourselves.
But London and King George did not appreciate the nuance.
No. To the king and to Parliament, this was the last straw. This was open rebellion. Boston had to be punished. And not just punished, it had to be crushed, made an example of, so no other colony would dare defy them again.
This brings us to the Coercive Acts of 1774. The Americans gave them a much better name, the Intolerable Acts.
And rightfully so. This was not legislation. This was retribution. These laws were designed to dismantle the society and the government that Massachusetts had built over 150 years.
Let's run through them quickly. First, the Boston Port Act.
Simple and brutal. It closed the port of Boston to all trade effective June 1st. No food in, no goods out, until the destroyed tea was paid for in full. It was a deliberate attempt to starve the city into submission.
Second, the Massachusetts Government Act.
This was the one that really scared the other colonies. It unilaterally revoked the Massachusetts Charter of 1691. It banned town meetings, the bedrock of New England democracy, allowing only one per year. It gave the royal governor sweeping new powers. It essentially deleted democracy in Massachusetts and put the colony under military rule.
Then there was the Administration of Justice Act, which George Washington himself called the Murder Act.
This allowed any royal official or soldier accused of a capital crime while performing their duties to be sent to England or another colony for trial. The colonists believed this gave British soldiers a license to kill protesters, knowing they'd just get a slap on the wrist from a friendly court back home.
And finally, a new Quartering Act,
which gave the military governor, General Thomas Gage, the power to house soldiers not just in barracks, but in occupied private buildings, like taverns and inns, if necessary.
And as if that wasn't enough, there was the Quebec Act. Now, this wasn't technically part of the punishment for Boston, but the timing was deeply suspicious to the colonists.
Terribly suspicious. The Quebec Act did two things that horrified the Protestant English colonies to the south. First, it expanded the province of Quebec's borders down into the Ohio Valley, into land that colonies like Virginia claimed.
So cut off their westward expansion.
And second, it granted religious freedom and legal protection to the French Catholic population of Quebec. To the Protestant New Englanders, who had spent a century fighting what they saw as papist tyranny, this looked like a grand conspiracy. They thought the king was preparing to use a Catholic army from Canada to subdue his own Protestant subjects.
The paranoia is just running off the charts at this point.
It's not just paranoia if they are actually out to get you. And from the colonists' perspective, It was clear that Parliament was out to destroy their way of life.
So we arrive at our final section, unification, 1774. Britain's strategy was divide and conquer, isolate Boston, make an example of them, and the other, more moderate colonies will be frightened into falling in line.
It was a catastrophic miscalculation. It had the exact opposite effect. Instead of shunning Boston, the other colonies embraced it. They saw the attack on Massachusetts' charter as an attack on all of their charters.
The Virginia House of Burgesses declared a day of fasting and prayer in solidarity with Boston, and supplies rice from South Carolina, sheep from Connecticut, flour from Pennsylvania started pouring into the blockaded city overland.
The slogan became, "The cause of Boston is the cause of America." The Intolerable Acts, designed to break them apart, welded them together.
And politically, this led directly to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in September 1774.
This was the big one. 12 colonies sent delegates. Only Georgia, the most remote and dependent on royal protection, stayed home. You have all the heavy hitters in one room, George Washington and Patrick Henry from Virginia, John and Sam Adams from Massachusetts, John Jay from New York.
But they weren't all on the same page yet. This is crucial. We tend to think they met and immediately started writing the Declaration of Independence.
Not even close. They didn't. There was a huge contentious debate between the radicals, who were leaning toward separation, and the moderates, who still hoped for reconciliation.
I was surprised to see Joseph Galloway's Plan of Union in the notes. He was a delegate from Pennsylvania, and he proposed a formal American parliament that would work with the British Parliament. It was basically a proposal for something like dominion status.
It was a very sensible, forward-thinking compromise. A grand council, elected by the colonial assemblies, with a president general appointed by the king. And I'm looking at the vote tally here. It was narrowly rejected by a margin of 1 vote. 6 colonies to 5.
1 vote.
One single vote. If one delegation had swung the other way, the Continental Congress might have petitioned for a formal union within the empire instead of preparing for war. History hung by a thread right there.
But the radicals won the day. Instead of Galloway's plan, they endorsed the Suffolk Resolves,
which had been passed in Massachusetts. They were radical. They declared the Intolerable Acts unconstitutional and void. They urged the people of Massachusetts to form their own government, withhold taxes, and arm themselves for defense.
And then they created the Continental Association.
This might be the most important thing they did. The Continental Association sounds like a gentleman's club, but reading the details, it was a ruthless enforcement machine for a total trade embargo.
No British imports, no exports of American goods to Britain or the West Indies. A complete economic shutdown.
And to enforce it, they mandated that every town and county set up local committees of inspection. These committees would monitor merchants and publish the names of anyone who broke the boycott in the newspapers.
Public shaming.
And total social ostracization. If your name was on that list, nobody would trade with you, nobody would talk to you. You were a pariah. It forced every single person in the colonies to pick a side. You were either a patriot, abiding by the association, or you were a loyalist, a friend of government. There was no middle ground anymore.
By late 1774, the atmosphere is electric. We have the powder alarm in September.
General Gage secretly removed the colonial militia's gunpowder from a storehouse near Boston. Rumors flew that the British had bombarded the city and that war had begun.
And the reaction was instantaneous.
Within 24 hours, 20,000 militiamen from all over New England grabbed their muskets and started marching toward Boston. It turned out to be a false alarm, but it was a dress rehearsal. It proved that the network worked. The provincial army was ready. They just needed a signal.
And King George III sees this. He's getting these reports. He writes a letter to his prime minister, Lord North, saying, "The die is now cast. The colonies must either submit or triumph."
He knew. The time for politics was over. The psychological break was complete. The argument was going to be settled by force.
So to wrap up this deep dive, we've gone from 1763, a celebration of empire and loyalty, to late 1774, a complete breakdown of political and social order. The rights of Englishmen argument, which the colonists had relied on for a decade, had failed them. They realized that the British Constitution, which they loved, wasn't going to protect them from a parliament that believed its power was absolute.
They realized that if they wanted to preserve their liberties, that simple self-governance that Captain Levi Preston talked about, they would have to do it themselves, outside the system.
There is a quote from John Adams that you highlighted in the notes. He wrote this years later, reflecting on this era. He said, "The revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people."
That's the key takeaway. The war that starts in April 1775 at Lexington and Concord, that was just the violent conclusion of a political and psychological process that had already happened in the town meetings, the newspapers, and the taverns over the previous 11 years.
But I want to leave the listener with a final provocative thought. Throughout this whole period, from the Stamp Act onward, the colonies made offers. They said, we are willing to pay our share of the imperial debt. We are willing to contribute to our own defense. Just let us raise the taxes in our own assemblies. Let us write the check.
It was a standing offer. The old system of requisition, where the crown would ask a colony for funds and the assembly would vote to provide them.
If the British Parliament had simply said yes, if they had swallowed their pride on the principle of the thing and just accepted the money without needing to control the mechanism, would the United States exist today?
It is the great what if of the period. We might have evolved into a transatlantic federation, a sort of early British Commonwealth. But Parliament and the King couldn't accept the idea that sovereignty could be divided or shared. They believed power had to be absolute and centralized. And by grasping for that absolute control over the colonies, they ended up losing them entirely.
A lesson in management as much as it is in history. Don't let a fight over principle destroy a valuable relationship.
Indeed, a lesson that still resonates today.
Thanks for diving in with us. We'll see you next time.